Welcome, everybody. We're only a couple minutes late, and I think we have a critical mass, so we will start. And I will do a brief introduction of the panel. We're going to focus on poverty, and it's going to be poverty in a very large environment that we're going to talk about today. I'm George Ingram, and I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And our panel of true thought leaders today, I won't go into great depth on the bios because they're in the program. But to my right is Charles Kinney, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's a writer, he's a thinker, he's a commentator on a range of development issues. His most recent book, The Upside Down, The Rise of the Rest is Good for the West. As you can tell by the title, whereas most serious academics and researchers and analysts prove themselves by being very critical and skeptical, Charles has become the optimist among us. And being an optimist myself, I like that. The Guardian referred to Charles when they did their review of the book as an irrepressible optimist. I like that. And I think one of the key points I take away from his book is that there's a convergence, and we're all coming to the same space, and it's going to be in spite of all the challenges, it's going to be to our advantage. To Charles's right is Tessie San-Martin, who's president and CEO of PLAN. She has had careers in academia, in the private sector, in government, both bilateral and multilateral, and brings a vast experience to PLAN, and has been recognized herself not just as a practitioner, but as a thought leader and an innovator. Tessie has brought PLAN into being one of the first NGOs to commit to the IID standards of publishing their data. And I think other organizations are looking to PLAN now to learn from that experience. And she's playing a leadership role in the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Group, particularly in the area of local solutions and local ownership. And to Tessie's right is Eric Postel, who is Assistant Administrator for the 3E Bureau at AID. Basically, he has the expertise on every issue that there's not an established single bureau for at AID.
But not personally. That would be too much.
That would be too much. And the 3E stands for economic growth, education, and environment. But when I went to one of his town halls a few months ago, I found that there are about 15 different issues that bureau is responsible for. Eric comes from the private sector, and I think he's noted for really understanding the intersection of the public and private sector, and for being a very broad thinker on development. And I thank all three of you for taking the time for being on the panel today. Per these panels, I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the panel and then open it up to everybody else. And my first question has to do, as appropriate for this panel, on poverty. And with the spotlight in the last couple of months by Thomas Piketty's book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, the spotlight on the growing inequality, that growing inequality is the natural state of capitalism, especially under conditions of slow growth that we're experiencing now in the West and increasingly in some of the emerging countries. What have we learned from countries that have moved beyond poverty, and how to advance economic growth in a more inclusive way? And I'd like to start with Eric and work down the panel this way.
Thanks, George.
Economic growth is the name of your bureau.
So since everyone's going to talk, I won't try to cover the whole topic, but I'll just say a couple remarks. One would seem to go against this, but it's just something that our chief economist advises me that, you know, the reduction, there's been a lot of progress made vis-a-vis extreme poverty. 70% of the global reduction, though, came in China, in which at the same time that the inequality rose. So that's a thing that, you know, it's just data, and that's what the data says, I believe, on that. And so that's something that we have to factor in. But obviously at USAID, you know, we are very focused on inclusive economic growth and trying to structure a lot of our projects to factor that in and not do things that exacerbate it. And we know the problems that when it gets too extreme in terms of the inequalities, there's so many other issues that arise from that it's not really conducive to development. So, you know, a lot of our programs work try to work with the very poor, and so we have to keep our focus on that. But what we've seen from a number of the countries that have moved out of extreme poverty, per your question, is that obviously most of them have moved out through economic growth, through trade, and other aspects, and that's a big part of it. So the humanitarian programs are important, and they contribute to the topic, but without the economic growth, you're pushing uphill. So I want to just pause there so there's time for everybody.
Good. Tessie?
Okay, so I'm going to take a very different approach to the question from Eric, because I think that's what we're supposed to do. And it's true that inequality is rising, but like Charles, I am an optimist, which is why I like the books that Charles writes. And in fact, I was just talking to him earlier about his book, Getting Better, which does note that it is a fact that, you know, inequality is, you know, income inequality is growing. But, you know, I think you say in the book, there's a growing convergence so that, you know, over time, people are growing closer together in terms of, you know, level of educational attainment, quality of health, even beliefs about, you know, basic rights. And I think that's a pretty important observation. And then the question is, so why is that, right? And the other observation that you make is, and so it turns out that you don't have to be a rich country to get that, you know, get those improvements in level of education, in quality of health, and so on. It's cheap, right? Some of the good things in life really are cheap. And so then the question becomes, but what accounts, right? What are the drivers? What is behind getting those types of improvements? And then, you know, and forgive me because I'm going to keep on quoting you, so whatever.
You don't have to say anything, Charles.
Yeah, so you're done. I'm just going to say everything for you. But the issue here is, you know, is the power of, you know, ideas and innovation, right? And then the question becomes, so what accounts for that dissemination of ideas, you know, and innovation around things like, you know, educational attainment, quality of health, and so on and so forth. And here is, you know, where I think that there's a lot more research that needs to be done. Because usually we think of, you know, sort of technology dissemination and cool little things that, you know, suddenly everybody can, you know, bank with their mobile phone and so on. And in fact, most of the improvements that we're seeing in these areas, I think, are really due to much slower but very fundamental shifts in behavior. And that is pretty unsexy work, but is fundamental to, over time, changing things and creating pretty fundamental changes in health outcomes and the like. So then, you know, now, changing tax a little bit, the other sort of, so I'll leave you with that, you know, thought in mind. The other thing to just sort of illustrate some of this and make it more real is, you asked you asked us, George, one question. Okay, so what accounts for, the success or improvement in some countries? And, based on, research and observation, certainly that my organization and others have done, one of the very powerful things that you can do is educate girls. Right? Because we know that when girls are educated, you get, improved, health outcomes in the family and the communities. If girls are educated, they're going to also, it's going to have a positive effect on, age of marriage, is going to lead to better nutritional status for children, and so on. And in fact, getting girls to school, things that you can do to improve the likelihood that girls are going to get and stay in school, to Charles's point in his book, are really not particularly expensive. You don't have to spend a lot of money. A lot of it has to do with making sure that, you've got separate bathroom facilities, okay, so you have to spend something on bathrooms, and menstrual hygiene management, and it has to do with, with keeping, with making sure that, girls are safe in terms of getting to school and being in school. It's actually a lot of the things that you can do to keep girls in school have very little to do with pedagogy or books or anything. It's got to do with all kinds of things around that. And again, sort of fundamentally changing attitudes and behavior. And I don't think that we fully understand, as well as we should, how those types of major behavior changes get scaled up and get sustained over time.
And is what I interpret from what you're saying is one way that you make economic growth less unequal is to invest in some of these social aspects of development, into education, into girls' education.
Well, it's like a chicken and egg thing, right?
Okay.
Are you going to be, because you've invested in girls, are you going to be less unequal?
Right.
Or are you, yes, the answer to your question is yes, but I think it's a little bit more complex than that. So no,
Okay.
I'm not going to be pinned down on that.
Charles is going to resolve the complexity.
I think it's yes, but
Yes,
but they're all
yes,
connected.
right.
And thank you. I mean, I do think that the story on non-income measures of the quality of life is basically a more positive story, or at least over the last 50, 60 years has been a more positive story, both in terms of convergence across countries, but also convergence within countries. The poorest, the least advantaged in terms of education and health have actually seen some of the biggest gains, both within and across countries, in a way that we haven't seen with income. I'm greedy, I want it all, I want income to follow the same pattern going forward. And I do think we know some things about how to do that, and actually I think we've learned some things from the United States about how to do that. I mean, for a start, actually, it's not really rocket science how you make the incomes at the top of a distribution slightly less and the incomes at the bottom of a distribution slightly more. You tax the people at the top of a distribution. You give the money to the people at the bottom of a distribution. You do not need a degree in economics to figure this one out. I realize that one is politically more complicated than some other approaches, so let me give you one which is maybe more straightforward, and again applies in the United States but also in China, which, as Eric says, is a place where we've seen perhaps some of the biggest absolute gains against absolute poverty over the past 20 years. So in the United States, up until about 20 years ago, the incomes of the poorest states were catching up with the incomes of the richest states at about 2% a year. You're seeing convergence between poor parts of the country and rich parts of the country. And one big factor driving that was lots of people from poor parts of the country who didn't have very many opportunities moved to rich parts of the country where they had more opportunities and it was easier to get a good job. The convergence between states over the last 20 years in the United States has slowed down to about 1% a year. At the same time, and deeply connected, I believe, we have seen a slowdown in the movement of people across states. And that's got a lot to do with communities like the one I live in. Somerset's a lovely part of just north of the DC border, where basically there are zoning rules and rules on how many people can live in the household and so on and so forth, which make the houses very expensive and make it very difficult for poor people to live there. Now, Somerset is a rich community that's doing very well, which could support, you know, a lot more people. It's where the jobs are. And we're basically keeping people out of Somerset in order to keep the quality of life higher for people like me and my children. Now, you know, so I'm guilty, right? I'm part of the problem. You see that same thing sort of play out on a really bigger scale in China and India. China, over the last 20, 30 years, has seen this massive reduction in poverty. And one of the big reasons for it is more than 100 million people in China have moved from poor parts of the country to rich parts of the country, and they've got richer doing so. India is not seeing convergence across states, and it doesn't see nearly the same level of movement of people. Now, India has seen some pretty dramatic progress against poverty over time, but had you seen the same level of movement of people across Indian states as you've seen in China, not only would you have seen faster overall economic growth in India, you would have seen faster pro-poor economic growth. And I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. I mean, you know, I want to talk about taxes and helping people move, but you know, if we're not going to talk about taxes because we all think that's a non-starter, let's talk about how do we make it easier for people to move to where the jobs are.
And can you tell us about the positive movement on the Gini scale in Brazil? Brazil's been one of the exceptions in the last 10 years. For 30 years, we all knew that Brazil was one of the least equal countries, and now suddenly in the last decade, has that been education? Has it been the Bolsa? What?
Well, I mean, it's been a bit of both. I mean, it has actually been somewhat about taxing rich people and giving money to poor people. The way that the money was given in a lot of cases was through conditional cash transfers. So, you know, if parents kept their kids in school, they got more money. If parents made sure their kids were vaccinated, they got more money. So it was a cash transfer from rich people in Brazil to poorer people in Brazil, but it was one that also helped deal with some of the education and health issues that we've been talking about. It was a twofer, and I think that's a great way of doing it. To be honest, if you ask people like Lance Pritchett about, you know, what is it, why do the conditions really matter, he would say, yeah, it's great. It had a marginally bigger impact on health and education than just giving the money unconditional. But the real thing is, it made it politically saleable to people like us, the taxpayers, right? Mm-hmm. Now, to be honest, I don't know if that's true. To be honest, I'm not sure I really care whether it's what makes it politically saleable, or and that's the ultimate reason for doing it or not. It ended up with a lot more money going to poor people, and because of the conditions and because of the money, the lives of poor people improved. Yay, success.
Good. Tessie or Eric, anything on Brazil before I move on?
No, what he said. No, I mean, the conditional cash transfer program there.
Made a big difference.
I think so, yeah.
The recently released results of the 2011 International Comparison Program, an every decade effort to calculate national wealth using purchasing power parity rather than the normal calculation by exchange rates, indicates that poverty's been cut in half. $600 million people in extreme poverty rather than 1.2 million. It also reveals that many developing countries are wealthier than we thought. Some colleagues at Brookings have taken that data and recalculated it with an inflation-adjusted number for extreme poverty of $1.55 and determined that the reduction is only half that level, 1.2 billion to 900 million. Still, significant reduction. And I've got several questions. And I'm going to ask you to start, Charles, because I want you to answer the first sub-question, which I will save your two colleagues from having to address.
Oh, thank God.
And that is, in determining national wealth using exchange rates or purchasing power parity, which is better? Which is more realistic? Which is more useful?
For national wealth, it depends.
You're an economist,
Spoken
aren't
like
you?
a true economist, that's good.
So if what you're worried about is when is China going to be the world's biggest economy, although I have played this game, I admit, actually you shouldn't really use PPP. It doesn't make much sense. If you're most worried about the quality of life of individual Chinese people as compared to individual people in North Korea or Taiwan or the United States, PPP. PPP adjusts for things like it's cheaper to get a haircut in actually probably not in Beijing anymore, but it's cheaper to get a haircut outside of Beijing in China than it is in DC. So, if you're worried about quality of life, the PPP numbers are a more accurate representation of the quality of life than the exchange rate numbers. If you're worried about global economic dominance, for some reason, I would stick with market exchange rates. And if you're an American who's worried about global economic dominance, the advantage of doing that is you have another, 15 years to wait until you have to go, oh, China's the biggest economy. If you really think PPP is what matters, you've got till December, so have a good Christmas.
Very good. Now, to continue with this question, and more importantly, what do these new statistics indicate about reducing and eliminating global poverty? We've thought the last several years that the MDG goals of halving poverty had been met. We now see we've done better than we expected. What does this tell us about the opportunity with the new set of global goals for achieving zero poverty, extreme poverty? And secondly, why are we focused on extreme poverty? Why aren't we focused on poverty? Say, those who live on less than $10 a day or less. Anyone who's simply below the basic level of poverty is probably unable to meet her family's needs. So why aren't we focused there? Charles, and we'll move down the panel.
To take in reverse order somewhat, I think we should focus on $10 a day poverty. The US poverty line is give or take $12.50 per head. Anybody living on the US poverty line or below, I believe, is poor. I believe that holds whether that person is living in the United States or in China or in India or in Africa. Do not declare success at $1.26 a day. That's not living. It is a useful measure of progress, right? It's something that we think we all understand, although I'll get to that in a minute. $1.25 a day, sounds easy, know what it is. And getting over that line, if everybody gets over that line, that is a sign that everybody is a bit richer than they were before. So that's good news, and it's one thing that I'm quite happy to see us measure. And I'm delighted to see a goal for ending extreme poverty appear both in the President's State of the Union a couple of years ago. I'm happy to see it appear in USAID documents. I'm happy to see it appear as a World Bank target. I will say one thing about it, though, which is the discussion on how many people suddenly were lifted out of poverty Tuesday 2 weeks ago by the new PPP numbers is a sign of something very strange going on, right? Statisticians recalculated global relative prices and said, yeah, they're not poor anymore. It doesn't really work like that, right? The problem is with the way we set this poverty line, where a whole bunch of very well-meaning and very smart people in the World Bank had a bash of it in 1990 and came up with some poverty numbers. And then in 2005, new set of PPP numbers came out. The bank didn't like some of them, did like others of them, kind of took some of the PPP numbers, didn't take others of the PPP numbers, tried a new approach to coming up with an international poverty line and said, oh, look, here's a new international poverty line. And then here we are in 2011, we've got data from 2011. We've got a whole new set of PPP numbers, and everybody in the World Bank right now, honestly, I know, I've talked to a few of them, are running around desperately trying to figure out, well, okay, hang on, what are we going to do to the poverty line? It's all done after the fact, kind of ad hoc, and very lacking transparency, shall we say. And one thing that I really think needs to happen before 2015 is we have to come up with a definition of extreme poverty that everybody knows what it is, everybody agrees, everybody knows that we can track that number to 2030 on a consistent basis. The data on which the poverty numbers come up with are open and available to all, so we can all replicate to see whether we agree with the World Bank's numbers on poverty. The system has to be set. We are declaring this number, or at least we're declaring this approach to coming up with a number is the approach we will use to declare this is a level of extreme poverty. We have set the goal of ending zero poverty by 2030. It's about darn time we set the goalposts.
Good. Tessie.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a big benefit to having a target. Politically is very useful. What gets measured gets done, and so on. But like Charles, honestly, I'm not really sure that just because somebody's making 126 or 156, we get to declare victory and go watch the World Cup in Brazil. So, it doesn't mean, anything, and it doesn't say, it doesn't say anything about, inclusion, right? And it doesn't say anything, and what's happening to marginalized groups and things like that. It doesn't say anything about sustainability either. And so what I would hate to see happen is that, we're really so focused on eradicating, extreme poverty that we lose sight of, education and health rights, which are hugely important investments that if they don't get made, whatever gains, we're making as we're recalculating this again, are potentially not going to be sustainable, because that's the other thing. I mean, the question of whether, you're right, whether we set it at 125, 155, or 10, I would argue, 10 makes more sense, because there's a level of fragility with, with that level that I don't think, I don't think it's just, I think that just focusing on that is not particularly useful. I'm also reminded by, George, that I read Ritu Sharma's soon-to-come-out book, Teach a Woman to Fish, and one of the things she talks about in that book is living on $1.25 a day, in several communities, and it's impossible, to Charles' point, but it's illustrated very nicely. If you're trying to live on that, you're not living.
Well, I will tell Rito, too, that you gave her a shout out. I've read
Yeah,
the book,
read the
too,
book. It's coming out in
and
June.
In
It's
June,
good.
June 10th, it's a must-buy.
Yeah, it is good.
Really
book.
good. And what it does is it brings human stories to all of the policy work we do.
Right.
And all of the pragmatic field work we do. So it's really good. Eric?
So on the second of the three-part question,
Oh, come on. Try the first one.
Yeah, I was so happy you didn't ask me.
what does this change mean in terms of the opportunity to achieve zero extreme poverty? The thing is that the hardest part of those still below the line, whatever the line is, are in really complicated, difficult places. So I'm not sure whether the line makes any difference on doing the final part. We're talking about difficult places like Haiti, DRC, Nigeria, and so forth. So on that, the job was the same the day after as the day before. On the third third part of it, I just say a couple quick things. First of all, I can just tell you what happened at the senior management of USAID the day it was announced, which is that nothing changed. So, our work continues, and people were briefed, and we charge ahead. I think the one thing that's implied in, there's a couple things, though, vis-a-vis your question of the $10 a day, which is a question that I know for a fact that the U.S. government has informed an opinion about, but at what point, I fully agree with the comments that you still need to work on these things at $2.50 a day, because that's still a very difficult existence. But at what point are the countries then responsible solely? Is there still a role for ODA at $10 a day versus $2.50 versus $1.55 or whatever? I think that's another interesting conversation that a lot of people could weigh in on. I don't know of anybody who's definitively opined on it. We don't have a policy position, but there's that aspect too. Because as you point out, we have serious poverty questions in our country, but we're not going outside for people to solve that. It's for us to solve, unless you call buying our bonds.
Great. I have a third and a fourth question, and I'm going to pose the third question now, but hold off on the fourth one, so I turn to the audience quicker. The report of the UN High-Level Commission, which has been mentioned more than once today in these conversations, raises a number of interesting issues about achieving broad-based economic growth and reducing poverty. I'd like to ask your thought on three, and I'll ask you to start, Tessie. Okay. One is universality. Should the new set of goals apply universally? The MDGs applied only to developing countries. but the UN panel suggests that the new set should apply to all countries. John Norris at the Center for American Progress and a couple of colleagues in the last couple of weeks have released an interesting paper which identifies how each of the indicators from the high-level panel report would apply to the US. Is universality the right approach? And how will the West view having to have a set of goals applied to it? Secondly, private finance. The MDGs were all about assistance. The high-level panel asserts that the new set of global goals will have to be financed by domestic resources and international private flows. Is this assertion correct? And what role is left for official development assistance in the post-2015 world? And thirdly, no one left behind. What does it really mean, and how is it translated into practice? Tessie?
Wow, okay, all of them?
All of them.
Okay, all right. Well, so I'll be quick, and then we can explore it more in the Q&A. So on the issue of universality, I mean, I think for me, the short answer is yes, of course. Of course it should apply to the United States. And I have to say, it's interesting because, you know, PLAN is a federation, and, you know, like many of these federations, it was formed, well, like 76 years ago. And the model of the federation is you've got the rich countries in the north, you know, mostly OECD countries, like the US. You know, our role is to mobilize resources to then give to the poor countries, you know, in the south. And anyway, I say this because we've been having this very active dialogue in the Federation around just simply not having, because national offices like mine are the rich countries, country offices are the program countries, and we're saying there shouldn't be North and South anymore, it should just be all member countries, because in fact, there are needs here in the United States, and you know, we should all be working towards children's rights in every country that we're in, rather than just say that this is just a problem for poor countries, because it's not. You know, absolutely, universality, I think, is important. Politically, will it sail? I don't know, but you didn't ask me about the politics of it. I'm just telling
Go
you
ahead.
how I feel. Well, I think the politics of it are difficult, if only just based on my little federation, you know?
The politics are difficult in your federation.
Well, yeah, you know, because that's not how, you know, countries like the United States like to view each other. This is somebody else's issue, right? But I think there would be great benefit, and it would, you know, sort of the signaling effect of it being a universal goal that we're all working towards, I think would be very powerful. On the private finance, well, I mean, look, there's ODA, there's private finance, and then there is sort of local country finance, right? And I think sort of the ultimate goal, you know, as Eric was alluding to in his question is, you know, so for how long is ODA, you know, relevant? I mean, what you ultimately want, certainly what we want to see, for example, at PLAN and communities where we work, where we will exit when we see, you know, important programs, you know, around children's rights and so on, being funded, you know, locally. They should be funded locally. They should be appearing in budgets. And that to me is a measure, is not the only measure, but is a measure of sustainability. Because at that point, we've grown very used to having a world where donors set, you know, objectives and targets, and then give countries money to pursue those objectives and targets. Those may or may not be the objectives and targets of the country. So ownership of the issues and local funding of those issues and those rights to education and so on, I think that's the ultimate objective. And is there a role for ODA in that, even in $10 a day countries? I do think, you know, it can be a catalyst for that, for ODA and for, you know, private money from abroad, right? Because I think where we're headed is is a world where, and the earlier panel was talking about sort of blended approaches. It's not just purely now an ODA issue or a private sector issue, is how do we blend all of these various resources that we have for maximum impact. And I think, you know, all of us in the industry, for lack of a better word, are still sort of struggling with that, and we can talk a little bit about that later. Then the third one about no one left behind. What was the question about that? Should anybody be left behind?
Well, what is it in practice? I mean, it in some ways it sounds like a campaign slogan. But what does it mean in practice?
Well, I mean, in practice for me is the inclusion agenda, right? Is looking at the most marginalized groups and making sure that we're also looking at specifically what's happening to them. Because a lot of things get lost in averages, right? And a lot of things get lost in national statistics. So for me so how do we make sure that we're keeping our eye on that ball, you know, as we're feeling really good about all of the other things that we're accomplishing? I'll leave it at that.
Eric, when you address these three topics, don't cut short your thoughts on domestic resource mobilization, because I think people really need to hear how you're trying to lead not just your agency, but the community in that direction.
Okay, so on the first one, I'd just say that the U.S. government hasn't finalized its position about that, and so people are discussing it.
What are you whispering into Podesta's ear?
No comment. I like how Tessie put it in terms of no one left behind. I think she said it very well. And so on the case of private finance, and you know, is there a role for ODA and all those things? So if you look at whether it's education, I mean, Beck has done reports looking at and other people in terms of, you know, what's the total need to deal with the problems versus what is currently spent. If you do the same thing for health, infrastructure, water, everywhere, the gap are really big numbers. And so private ODA is clearly, the initial response for maybe 15, 20 years has been, oh, the way you close that gap is 0.7. We've seen where that conversation has led, and I'm not even sure that all that math fully works today. But so clearly, there's a need for private flows of a variety of things and domestic savings and things like that. I'll come back to that. Does that mean, therefore, that ODA will be irrelevant? No, I don't think so. And I could say that from a couple points of view. But even if there was all this incredible growth and everybody, all the countries that, quote, graduated or whatever, you know, one component of ODA is humanitarian assistance. And I mean, that is one of the things that the American people have always been most enthusiastic about, which is helping other countries in times of need. So that component of ODA, for instance, I can't imagine that because of American people, when they see these disasters, they want to help, whether they're middle income or not. So, you know, just look at all the tweeting going on in the last 24 hours because of what's going on in Serbia and Bosnia. So, and there are other reasons why I think ODA would be still relevant, including that in some things, although I've worked on private finance for a long time, there are some things that private finance is just not well equipped to do. Some social safety net things, but, and then some other things. Back in the early 90s when people like Gene and I and others were working to create capital markets in countries, one of the things was to create securities regulatory regimes and stock exchanges and things. You're not going to create a securities regulatory regime with private capital. That's just almost an oxymoron. You've got to do that with some sort of government funding, and then the question is it ODA or is it domestic resources? So as you teed up, I personally believe that one of the very important things that we need to discuss a lot more these days is domestic resource mobilization, which some people think of as raising tax revenues domestically, and that's part of it, but it's not all of it. Things like domestic savings, pensions, and so forth are another big part of that. And I'm certainly not the only one that thinks that. We just had the meetings in Mexico City, which was the sort of 2-year follow-up to the Busan meetings of everybody involved in development from governments all over the world, and some of the most passionate speakers about this were people from developing countries. And you see the way the conversation's going, because in Busan, there was one panel. It was in the last day on the last hour. In Mexico City, in 2 days of meetings, there were three focus sessions, and out of 5 plenaries, one of them was on this. And some of the people heavily engaging on this were people like the Minister of Finance in Nigeria, the Minister of Finance of Malawi, who said 40% of my budget comes from donors and it's wildly unstable, and I can't plan and I can't manage and I can't help my country grow. You had the, on the telling the success story side, the Minister of Planning and Development from the Philippines talking about how through better enforcement of taxes, more work to stop smuggling, and cleaning up efforts within the agency, that their equivalent of the IRS, where they've literally fired hundreds of employees who were taking bribes to not collect taxes, and with some new sin taxes, that they've raised the amount of money that the government has significantly, and then been able to reinvest that into social safety net things like conditional cash transfers, education, health, and so forth. So some people had been suspicious that this is a topic that donors have been talking about as a way to get out of donating. But what you see is some of the most passionate people about this are in partner countries, because they want to start controlling their own destiny, and they also see that the amount of donor funds are fairly steady, and in some countries declining, and meanwhile they've been growing. And so they realize that this is a huge opportunity for them to take care of their people, to help keep a virtuous cycle going where they're able to reinvest more in their country's development and thereby contribute to even more success, and also to enable them to really take charge of their own development. As several years ago when I was in the Help Commission, we were in northern Mozambique, and there was we went to this place where there was an entrepreneur developing the cashew industry up there, and the fellow turned to us and said, the sooner the government gets its revenues from people like me instead of like people like you, the sooner it'll start listening to people like me instead of people like you. And that's part of, I think, why people are behind this. Do I think it's the sole, do I think it's the magic fix? No, you've got to have economic growth, but there's a lot of possibilities, and there have been success stories in a number of countries on this, and oftentimes with very high payoffs, where countries have put in maybe 5s and 10s of millions of dollars once up front, and when there was political will, they raised dozens and dozens of dollars every single year flowing in to pay for their development. So I don't think it's any one thing. Infrastructure is particularly conducive to private sector financing in many cases. Other parts of other endeavors are, and we know that huge amounts are being invested. And you see where there's some synergies. I mean, Walmart talks about investing in educating women and girls because they're investing in their future customers and their future workforce. I mean, they are out to make money, but there are synergies with development. So I think there's going to be a mix for all, but I do think that the only way you really solve some of these problems and move towards graduation and a whole bunch of these things is to raise more revenues domestically and to get more private sector flows involved. So
Great, thanks.
I took you at your word and rattled on for a while.
And that's exactly what I wanted, thank you. I have one follow-up question, Eric, but first to Charles.
Just I want to follow up on what Eric said, just to say that in 1990, aid flows were equal to about 2% of developing country GDP. Today, it's about 0.5%, and it's going down. So, you know, aid remains really important and has all of these roles in leveraging private finance, in encouraging countries to provide global public goods that they wouldn't do otherwise, a growing role in the environment. I mean, so aid still has a role, but you know, as the the major financier of anything much anymore in developing countries. It's just completely implausible to suggest it can keep that role going, which, by the way, is a sign of huge development progress, and we should take it as a sign of success. But anyway, so I think that's absolutely right. To go third last, No One Left Behind is a way to get an inequality goal into the post-2015 agenda when an inequality goal will never get into the post-2015 agenda for political reasons. And actually, I think it's not a bad way of getting an inequality goal into the post-2015 agenda by the back door. If by No One Left Behind, what you mean is that those who are furthest behind see the most progress, i.e. you see reduced inequality over time, I'm all in favor of a No One Left Behind goal. And I think that is, for whatever reason, more politically saleable, and so I'm fine with it. On the universality thing, I'm actually a little more worried. John Norris's report, and do read it, it's a fascinating document, and I should say it's co-authored by Casey Dunning from CGD. Right. So John and Casey's report on universality is fascinating. One of the reasons it's fascinating is it does take these sort of global goals and says, well, what would you use to measure this stuff in the United States? And the answer comes back is you use different measures than you would in Africa for measuring things like poverty or measuring good quality of jobs. Kind of course you would, right? Now, that's fine. It is a problem in that what made the MDGs such a huge success as a sort of a rallying point was it was 2/3 reduction in child mortality. It's the same goal for the world. It wasn't 2/3 reduction in child mortality in Sudan, 2/3 reduction in children 1 standard deviation under average birth weight in Maryland. It was one target universally. And the reason that these goals had power is it was a one agreed target in an area that was universally agreed by the world's leaders. It had consensus at the global level, if you will. Even if you got a whole bunch of goals at the national level that you then kind of try to add up into some sort of global development goal at the UN, they wouldn't be consensus goals at the national level. Nobody's actually suggesting that the US tries to get through the Senate and the House a bill saying, here's what we think our 2030 targets ought to be. It'll be the view of an administration, this administration, which won't be around for too much longer. By 2030, US goals on this kind of thing will be forgotten. Global goals, where at one moment all the world's leaders came together and said, yeah, they'll remain. And so I think it's really important, while I think there's, the goals can be universal in that they can apply to all countries, they have to be the same goals with the same numerical time-bound targets attached. And that's just a really important part of the success of the MDGs, and I think it will be a really important part of the success for the post-2015. One area I think that applies to in particular is the partnership goal. The last MDG 8 was pathetic. It was weak. It set basically no numerical targets. This time around, take something that was in the last lot, duty-free, quota-free access to goods from low-income countries. That was assumed to apply to high-income countries last time around. I think every country worldwide should be giving duty-free, quota-free access to low-income countries, including other low-income countries. I think there is a way to make a stronger global partnership that is actually more global, more universal this time around, and that would be a real strength, not a weakness. So while I'm a bit worried about, although I think it's a fascinating exercise, a bit worried about going as far as John and Casey propose when it comes to nationalizing, if you will, the post-2015 agenda. I do think there is a real place for greater universality.
The floor is open for everybody. There are 2 microphones. I will disagree with Charles on his point on global goals. And I think that setting national goals through some sort of national process can be one of the most important things to come out of this new set of goals. And while you're thinking about your questions, I want to ask Eric on this enthusiasm that he's seen from developing countries for a greater focus on how to mobilize domestic resources through the tax system, through better management of natural resources. Are you seeing that just from the better off, better governed developing countries that are emerging, moving into middle income, or are you seeing it in some of the really poor countries too?
Well, think of one of those three ministers I mentioned, and you can come to your own conclusions about that country on those criteria that you mentioned. But no, I don't think it's every country. Some have more other things on which they're focusing, but I do think it's a wide variety of countries that are coming to it. And of course it ebbs and flows. I heard a story about one place that's, I think everybody in the room would consider to be a pretty difficult place to operate. And the government there, within the last year, actually tried to enforce existing laws on customs at the border. And all of a sudden, about 2 weeks later, there were people in the streets demonstrating and doing things, and they were trying to figure out what's the issue. They couldn't really tell. And it turned out that some of the vested interests had basically paid people to go in the streets and make trouble, and their real issue was about the enforcement at the border. And in this case, the government didn't feel strong enough to fight it. They dropped it, and the people in the street disappeared. So this stuff is really hard to do stuff, and so every country's in a different spot politically and so forth. I mean, Secretary Clinton put out a challenge to Pakistan in a speech she gave there 4 or 5 years ago, saying, you can't really expect our taxpayers to fund your development if you're not doing your fair share. So it's a discussion that's going around the world in different countries to varying degrees, but it's not strictly confined to the countries that are at the top of doing business indicators or MCC criteria or any other set of indicators that's out there.
Good. Please, the floor is yours. The panel has done its job. Now it's your turn to do your job of asking the panelists interesting questions. Charles would be particularly happy if you disagreed with something he said. So please.
Nobody disagrees with anything I said.
Nobody?
Ha-ha.
Only me. And please identify yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Malika Walton with CUSO International. I wanted particularly Charles, but anybody else, to comment on the role of youth employment, entrepreneurship as kind of a goal for global development. And the reason I'm asking that, or no, reduction of poverty, I'm sorry. The reason I'm asking is because Charles mentioned that you reduce poverty when you move. And most of these goals that so many organizations are working on in terms of youth entrepreneurship and livelihood development, sustainable livelihood, is in place. It's not a moving to where the jobs are, it's trying to create jobs there. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about whether that actually works and whether, for reduction of poverty.
Gosh, I want to bat this to Eric. I do not claim to be an expert on youth employment programs, so I'm really going to bat that to Eric. But my guess would be, if I was more informed, my answer would be that both is good. For a start, practically you can't move everybody. For all sorts of reasons, people stay where they are. So migration can't be the only solution to every problem. I do think it has a huge role to play, and one that we underappreciate in the development community. But improving youth employment prospects in place is also a good thing. And so I don't see them as an either/or. But
So I would say that sort of a tentative yes, but I think it depends on the conditions in the country. I mean, in some countries, if there's no growth and there aren't any jobs, then the youth programs, in the extreme case, can raise expectations, but there's nowhere for them to go, right? But it's not so linear, as you know, because you could have youth entrepreneurs who could single-handedly create a source of growth, right? So even in those cases, there are some interventions and things that can happen. Obviously, the issue of youth workforce development and entrepreneurship and just flat-out education is really, really important. It might interest you to know, we just had our USAID Mission Director Conference. The heads of all our overseas offices were in town last week. And before the conference, when they were working on the agendas, they did a survey about what topics they wanted to talk about. And, you know, there were things about internal matters like personnel management and, you know, extreme poverty. There were different things. But one part of the survey literally went through about 25 different sectoral type topics. The number one topic that our office directors wanted to talk about, youth, which is a quick way of showing what a big, big issue it is in so many countries. I have to say, not specifically on youth, but I'm personally a big fan of something that was pioneered out of, I think, Harvard and MIT, which is growth diagnostics, which we've sort of done work on and modified them to inclusive growth diagnostics. But these are rigorous techniques. We used them in the Partnership for Growth. MCC uses them on all their projects or on their programs, which is to try to look for the binding constraints to growth. Because you can get a lot of people around the table and they'll argue for their individual sectors. Water's important, this is, every single thing. And we probably all would say, yeah, they're all important, but there's only so much bandwidth, so many resources, and so what are the real binding constraints? And in the Partnership for Growth countries, when that happened, it was interesting. They really varied by country. In El Salvador, one of the two main constraints was security. Literally, businesses not growing, they were capable of growing, but they couldn't because of the security. Employees who didn't want anybody to know they got a pay raise because it put their family at risk of being hostages and so forth. In Tanzania, it was rural roads and power. One of the reasons there's Power Africa is because that was determined there, and in Ghana, there were 2 or 3 constraints, and one of them was power also. And if you look across Africa, there was a lot of rigorous evidence, analysis to show that one of the binding constraints was power. So I think it's important in the countries to look at what are the binding constraints, work on those things to remove those constraints so that the country can grow. But then if it's growing already or not growing, one of the big areas where I think youth becomes so important is that you have the phenomenon which is also going on in our own country, which is that there are jobs and people aren't being trained to fill them. And you see that just in the United States. And I think a lot of people have done work on this. One piece that's been particularly influential with me is work that McKinsey has done, and you can find it on their websites, but why is that breakdown occurring? And so we need better, cost-effective, sustainable workforce development for youth so that we get them from where they are into what employers will pay for. Because that's the tragedy is in a number of countries, the youth are ready to work and the employers are ready to hire and they don't match.
Well, and I think actually very little to add to that, just to again underline, I mean, because you ask about what's the role of, youth workforce development, entrepreneurship. Boy, because it's a cross-cutting issue, right? For an organization like Plan, a lot of the work that we do with youth is really around a resiliency agenda, right? So it's not necessarily to get them to create all these jobs and, be the next Steve Jobs, but to have some resources to help support their family. It's also related to protection and security in a lot of, and actually in El Salvador, for example, in some of these, very violence-prone areas. But ultimately, as Eric says, a lot of the work around workforce development and youth really has to be about getting markets to work better. Because I know an organization like mine can spend a lot of time, on soft skills development and so on, but ultimately there really has to be a market and a way to connect the two. And oftentimes that doesn't happen or doesn't happen particularly well.
Other questions?
I'll step in. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Gabriel Liza. I work for the FAO Liaison Office for North America. I have a question, maybe some clarity to get from Kenny, from Charles, and from Eric. You made a comment about the need for aid or aid is dropping. When I meet and when we meet with ministers of trade, especially from Africa, what they're asking is to be able to trade. One of the ministers gave me an example that Uganda today is at the same place where Korea was, South Korea, 50 years ago. And now we have Samsung and cars and everything from South Korea. Why can't that happen in Africa? And the question for Eric is, oil and gas, look at the entire East Africa area. They're not gonna need money from outside. They're gonna need to manage the money they're gonna get from selling oil and gas. Are you helping them prepare for this new influx of dollar, or are we gonna have to deal with some terrible problems to come? Thank you.
Let's take your question, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Mark Peterson from USAID, and my question for any of the folks on the panel is, when it comes to reducing poverty at the national level or at the local level, are there particular innovations or new approaches, be they new policies or programmatic interventions, that you're excited about, that you think could change how we're approaching these issues?
Great.
Thanks.
Why don't we start with Eric and work down this way?
I can't pass up the very first part of your question, which is trade, because I also have some responsibilities in that area. And I just want to say that, yes, I think trade's really important. I will say that we have some challenges these days with the U.S. budgets in terms of development agencies, because after you factor in all the initiatives and the directives from Congress and the flat to going down top line, some parts of the budget are being squeezed a fair bit, such as in economic growth, including trade and democracy, rights, and governance. So but I think nonetheless, within what's there, we want to do a lot of work to try to support trade. The important thing that's happened within the last 6 months is the first ever WTO deal. And the WTO deal is focused on improving trade facilitation, which is their technical term, involving just getting that stuff moving across borders more effectively, quickly, transparently, and so forth. And we're doing a lot of work. We're not at the announcement stages, but within USAID and other parts of the government, we all definitely want to do our fair share to support that agreement, and that's a top priority on which my team and I are spending time, as well as other agencies such as USTR. On oil and gas, yes, in some countries we have helped the governments work on public financial management, in essence, about how to manage those revenues. There are other people that are very active in that also. I mean, World Bank has done some work. Paul Collier created a group to work on that. And obviously that is one of those areas that there have been some really bad failures where the money got wasted, and then other cases that are better situations. And when people get those natural resource windfalls, then you know, it's important to try to do the best folks can in terms of managing that. And I think I'll leave it to the others to speak to the second question rather than a USAID person talking to a USAID person.
I don't know. We want to know what you think are the most exciting.
Well, after they talk,
okay,
if
we'll
not
come
more
back to
questions.
you, Eric. Tessie?
I mean, on the, yeah, I'm not going to touch the oil and gas thing. On the innovation question, I mean, I think that there are a lot of really interesting things out there. And I think part of our challenge for everybody here is that we don't know enough about what other people are doing. I mean, you know, George mentioned the fact that, you know, we started to publish to IATI because I do think that there has to be a lot more transparency and knowledge about who's working in what, where. And ideally, over time, you know, what results, you know, are people getting with different things? Because right now, we don't know. And actually, the knowledge of what's working and what isn't working is all sort of very siloed. And of course, the countries themselves don't even necessarily have access to to all of that to all of that information. So that's just one plug. The other thing is, because rather than tell you what I'm excited about, because I'm really, every time I go to the field, I'm excited about a lot of things, but they're little tiny things that are making a difference. And I talked at the beginning about the fact that I really think that an area that is not as well understood is, and that is critical to the success that Charles has been talking about in terms of things that are really getting better, are things that have to do with getting culture change and getting behavior change, and how those things are disseminated. Usually there's no silver bullet for disseminating those innovations. It really is about peer-to-peer mentoring, almost one person at a time. And that's probably not very satisfying because it's not really cool. There's no gadget involved, but it can be very effective. And some of the so for example, in fact, I was recounting to Charles before the conference, before this panel. There was a fascinating article about in the New Yorker not too long ago about the fact that one of the most effective things that you can do, and we know about 3 million kids die every year at childbirth, basically. And among the most important things that you can do is to get better at regulating body temperature of the child. And that doesn't take an incubator, and it doesn't take really very complicated equipment. All it takes is for the nurse to know that she should take the temperature, and to know not to swaddle the child, but to give it to the mother so that the mother puts it directly with her body, because that's the best way of regulating the child's temperature. And if you do that, you can really reduce infant mortality tremendously. There isn't a single gadget involved there, maybe the thermometer, right? But getting the nurse to change what she does, that's the trick. And that's an innovation, by the way. Just as cool as an iPhone if you're in the business of, reducing child mortality. So, so anyway, I think that's it's a really good question, and I only say it because there are all of these, things that are going on about technology and the things that we want to invest in, and I think I think we continue to look for silver bullets in development, and honestly, I don't think that there are. I think there's tremendous work that's being done, but I really don't think that there are too many silver bullets, and we should probably stop promising them.
Good.
I would just want to echo, I do actually think that the whole behavior change thing is an exciting area to look at. And, all the stuff about nudges going on around the world, is part of that story. The conditional cash transfers are part of that story. Yeah. Using TV soap operas to give women stronger views about what rights they ought to have within the household is exciting. There's a lot of stuff there, and I do think it's very exciting. Just to go back to the question of beyond aid, absolutely. Beyond aid is needs to be core to post-2015. It needs to be core to anybody's thinking who cares about global development much more than it is. We shouldn't have aid as our default. Increasingly, we should not have aid as our default. We ought to be thinking about migration. We ought to be thinking about technology policy. The Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act is an abomination and needs to go. And it's not only bad for the United States, it's bad for everybody else who can't get access to things that should have been out of copyright 20 years ago. There's a whole technology agenda there that really matters globally. The environment clearly matters globally. We've got to be thinking about the whole suite and not just aid. And aid should actually, to some extent, be our last port of call, not our first, when it comes to development discussions. On trade in particular, I mentioned, I think everybody ought to be doing duty-free, quota-free for low-income countries as a first step. There is a lot more to go, and one of the reasons is partially because of why Uganda might have trouble following South Korea. Danny Roderick has some really impressively depressing data on what's happening to manufacturing. We all think that manufacturing decline in the United States is a rich country problem, and all the jobs have gone to China. That's not true. China is seeing declining manufacturing employment. India is seeing declining manufacturing employment. Manufacturing employment is declining worldwide, and it's because it's not just in the States that more and more stuff is being made by factories that require very few people and a lot of robots. That's just the more effective way to manufacture nowadays. Uganda is not going to get rich the way that South Korea did, or get richer the way that South Korea did. The story in Uganda, the same as the story everywhere else, is increasingly a story of services and trying to create decent jobs in services industries. We certainly haven't figured that out here. I don't think we figured it out anywhere else in the world. It's a big challenge for all of us, and we've got to move forward on it. But back to the trade agenda. One place where the trade agenda has been stalled forever is on the services issues. And that's because it involves movement of people. Frankly, as manufacturing disappears as a growth option for export-led growth, services as export-led growth is the way that countries are going to have to go. If they are going to go that way, we really have to think more about the movement of people one way or another. I'm sorry, it comes back to the third rail issue of migration. It just does. Very briefly on sort of beyond aid and other areas, I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on in the aid business at the moment. I think increasingly because of the sort of 0.5% of developing country GDP issue, the exciting stuff going on in aid at the moment is about leverage. It's like, how do you take a few aid dollars and make a lot of stuff happen? And domestic resource mobilization is one great example of that. But also we have things like cash on delivery aid, which DFID is trying in Ethiopia, providing not as much money as it costs to provide an Ethiopian girl an education through high school, but providing that money on the basis that Ethiopians get more girls to finish high school. Development impact bonds, where basically you, again, it's sort of cash on delivery, but you get the private sector to deliver a good, you pay for it once the good has been delivered, and the good might be, in the UK example of this, is reducing recidivism in prisons. So basically, you get a bunch of investors to go out there and invest in projects that are meant to reduce recidivism, and you pay them on the basis of their success. There's a lot of ways to use that in development contexts with aid resources. And when it comes, this isn't aid, but when it comes to oil, I think a very simple solution, partial solution to what to do with oil resources is give it to the people who own the oil resources. Alaska has a dividend fund. It hands over some of the oil revenues it gets every year straight to the people. We know from repeated experiment that cash transfers, conditional or not, have a dramatic impact on the quality of life of poor people. There are a lot of poor people in Tanzania. There's about to be a lot of gas revenues in Tanzania. Let's take some, not all of those revenues. They need better roads, they need better hospitals and all that, but let's take some of that revenue, just hand it straight to the people.
I'm from Tanzania, so I hope to get some of that money.
I hope you get it.
We are out of town. I apologize. And any other comments? Charles, being from Tennessee, I've never liked the Alaska model. And everybody has their own interest. What I get excited and most disappointed about AID is transparency. Slow movement, but where 2 years ago, AID finally moved out of the mode of writing policies in black boxes by 5 aid staffs, and with the urban services policy, before they put pen to paper, they met at about 4 different venues around Washington, started drafting, continued consultation, went back to those venues with the penultimate draft. Now that is open, transparent policymaking, which I believe results in a better, more knowledgeable policy, and you get community buy-in, and you don't have to go back and sell it to them after that. That's what I get excited about. We're 2 minutes over time. Thank you all for your attention. The panelists, thank you very much. Let's thank the panelists.
This Ritu Sharma book sounds great.
Yeah. What?
Charles.
What? No, it's not a
I really wanna
technology
get a
hater, it's just that,
conversation going on my
well,
last
if somebody has to talk.